Okay, so people actually started to move to the colonies a lot more in the later part of the 1600s, post 1650. And in fact, by the 1670s, there were 70,000 people living in New England alone. And colonial people started to establish their own kind of like colonial culture. They still pretty much considered themselves to be British first, but they started to develop some really unique American ways of life. And we're going to talk a lot about those in today's lecture. So first off, colonists were defined, or at least your social status was defined by the amount of wealth you had, what gender you were, and what race you were. And that basically broke down like this. The wealthy were very much superior to the poor. The men were always superior to the women. Women held very little status in society, and whites were always superior to blacks. Whether African Americans were slaves or not, they always were second class citizens or even third class citizens to white settlers. The big thing going on here is how these people were different. The wealthy usually wear nice wigs, silk stockings, lace cuffs, much better looking clothing. Their clothes were a lot brighter than less well-off colonists. And the wealthy usually spent money to travel in horse-drawn carriages that were driven by uniformed servants. They threw huge, lavish parties. They got involved in leisure activities because they had the time to do so. They paid servants to do all their work for them, or slaves. They'd gamble, they'd attend concerts, play billiards like pool, hunt. They were usually tutored by private teachers, at least the wealthy were. And they actually, kind of funnily enough, the last big difference is whether or not they knew their manners. And actually, the wealthy people had to actually purchase their manners. They had to buy things, essentially manner books, which taught them how to act appropriately, because a lot of them had kind of risen up from the lower part of society as either indentured servants or middle class folk, and then they got to America and all of a sudden they were wealthy. So some of the big differences here that we can just kind of quickly notice is that this guy's wearing buttons. They're probably made out of brass or silver. This woman, despite the fact that they're a man and a woman, the woman has no buttons on her clothes. Her clothes are basically two-toned. She's got a blue top and a white / light blue skirt and a white apron. He's got a huge wig on, a big old scarf, which is a big difference between wealthy and poor. And this guy's frankly got the time to sit down and have somebody paint him, which could take hours, if not days, whereas this woman did not. Oftentimes, your religion would equate to your social standing. Especially in the New England and the Chesapeake colonies, where people could literally demonstrate their wealth in church. The closer you were to the preacher usually meant the more wealthy you were, because you were quote unquote more elect or closer to God. And the planter class actually in the Chesapeake would basically emboss their pews with their names. They would have padded seats because it'd be a lot more comfortable. They would decorate their pews to kind of represent their family. They might have their family's coat of arms on there, which was a sign of your status and wealth back then. And this is essentially what the church seating chart would look like. The rich would sit at the front, closer to the preacher. They could see everything that was going on. Usually men and women were separated in the church. Men sat on one side, women sat on the other. Children usually sat in the back. Sometimes they sat with their families. It kind of just depended. But the back was always reserved for the poor lot. And slaves either stood in the back if they did attend church with their masters, or sat on the floor. It kind of all depended on what your master's beliefs were about whether or not you should attend church. Colonial jobs. So colonial jobs started to expand a lot during this time period because the colonists needed stuff that they couldn't get from England. There was a new demand because of a huge increase in colonial wealth. Colonists were making a lot more money at this point. And colonists became consumers as well as producers. They had choices about what to buy and who to buy from. Most families had to have all members of their kids work, though, to be able to afford anything, including the children. Some of the popular colonial jobs included artisans, which were like silversmiths, blacksmiths, cabinet makers, people who did stuff with their hands. They learned a handy trade, like in Pennsylvania. Some of them were printers, but printing could be a really scandalous job. You could be persecuted or prosecuted essentially for making false comments about a government official. And actually, the best example of that is John Peter Zenger. He was a writer for the New York Weekly Journal, and he was accused of printing scandalous stories that were critical of the governor of New York. He was acquitted of all charges, and that was like a landmark victory for freedom of the press, which is, of course, included in the First Amendment to the Bill of Rights. Most people, though, worked on farms, especially if you lived up in New England. Usually all your kids worked on the farm and attended school in the months that were not involved in farm work. So usually we're talking late fall, it's like early November through, I'd say, March, maybe April, depending on the weather and how cold it was. But all your kids worked in the fields. Farming was a hard job. It created some really tough, thrifty, and conservative people. P.S. To be thrifty is essentially to be cheap or to like kind of save your money and hold on to it because you probably didn't have a lot of it. Ladies, unfortunately for you ladies, life was pretty horrible. You were largely dependent on men. You had no legal or political standing. You couldn't vote in elections. No women could gain any kind of higher education. It was pretty rare for a woman to be able to read and write, especially if you were a lower class woman. If you were an upper class woman, you might have had some private tutoring, but that's not guaranteed. So these are all the jobs a woman would complete on a daily basis, unless they had servants. They'd cook all the family's meals, all three, breakfast, lunch, and dinner. They were responsible for tending the garden, which usually involved like the family's food supply. We're not talking about a farm here. We're talking about a garden. So kind of what you would think about if you had a garden at your own house nowadays. They'd be raising things like root vegetables, lettuce, tomatoes, etc. They did all the family's laundry with a washboard, which takes a while. No washing machines back then, kids. They'd clean the house, they'd sew all the clothes, and they were responsible for raising all the children. Now, mind you, they do all 5 of these jobs right here while doing this at the same time, keeping track of the kids and making sure they're not getting into trouble and teaching their daughters how to be a woman. So they were also a teacher, which is really kind of crazy. I know I couldn't do that job. The men had nearly unlimited power. It was a patriarchal society. They could beat their wives without punishment. The interesting thing that I find about this is that divorce was very much looked down upon unless you lived in Puritan New England, in places like Massachusetts, where they would rather somebody get divorced and stabilize society and not upset the balance of the social order and make things really awkward than have a bad marriage continue and disrupt society. So divorce was okay up in New England, which is kind of surprising because they were super religious up there. A man's work. So men usually did all the planting and harvesting of crops. They built fences to keep animals contained. They chopped wood every day. Every day you chopped wood, be it an hour, be it 2. Men could be shoemakers, gunsmiths, candle makers. These are all like handy trades. This is stuff you'd be doing if you were a farmer, but you would chop wood as well if you were a gunsmith or a candle maker. So this is one of my favorite things of all time to talk about. First off, colonial elections were really interesting, especially if you lived in the Chesapeake region of colonial America. Essentially, there were no such things as secret ballots, from what I can gather. And what would happen is you would show up at the town meeting house, and there are 2 candidates. They'd be at the front of the meeting house, and behind them would be their treats that they were offering their voters and supporters. And the treats there would be food, there would be meat, there would be cheese, and there would be drink. And when I say drink, I mean like a boatload of alcohol. We're talking rum, we're talking whiskey, we're talking cider, we're talking beer, we're talking ale, anything you could possibly imagine. And what would happen is you would stand in a line and wait to be called forward. Once you were called forward, you would declare your preference or vote for your candidate. And usually you voted based on who had the best stuff, because after you voted, you got to partake in the candidate's treats, and you basically get drunk with the candidate. It was a pretty great system. I think you get more people voting now if we actually had that system today. But hey, what are you going to do? So shopping became a thing back then. People had more money to spend. They would go to specialized shops to buy non-essential items. We're talking paintings, furniture, sewing supplies, gloves, clothing, napkins, plates. And then the last topic is colonial education. So attendance wasn't required at school. In fact, most colonial Americans received little, if any, formal education. But New England colonies were like the pioneers of education. The Puritan settlers believed that everybody should learn how to read the Bible, and so therefore they set up and passed laws that basically required that any town of at least 50 people had to hire a schoolmaster, and that schoolmaster would essentially teach the basic skills of reading, writing, and arithmetic. Eventually, though, they established colleges, that would expand their curriculum to include math, natural sciences, law, and medicine. And one of the first colleges to be set up in the American colonies was Harvard. So yeah, that's the American colonies. It's a brief overview and a really quick overview, but hopefully you enjoyed it.